So Paul Steinke, our next speaker, has a long and distinguished career himself in urban affairs of one sort or another, the University District and the Center City District. And he also, oh God, it's falling off. He also spent 11 years working for the Reading Terminal Market. And so we all have a huge debt of gratitude to you for making sure that that market is as vibrant and wonderful as it is today, because it is a great, those of us who grew up in Center City have been going for many years, before you were born. Anyway, but then Paul Steinke is best known recently as the director of the Preservation Alliance for Greater Philadelphia. And I just want to read it quick so everybody knows what the Preservation Alliance does. Membership-based organization whose mission is to promote the appreciation, adaptive reuse, and development of Philadelphia region's historic buildings, communities, and landscapes. And they really do an amazing job. I am involved. I am a tour leader, etc. So we welcome Paul to speak for us tonight. Do you want to hold this? Do you want to hold it, or do you want to leave it?
Yeah,
okay, see if you can. Okay,
I can
just watch out.
I think
it's
I
a
can
little
project.
Tippy canoe.
Great, thanks. Well, good evening, everyone. And it's an honor to be here. I want to thank Friends Meeting for inviting me tonight. Sean did that last summer, so I've had almost a year to think about what I'm going to say. Thank you to George for that introduction. He's become a great friend since he returned to Philadelphia from his exile in New York. And also to Bob. Bob is a dear friend for longer than either of us is probably willing to admit. But not only that, a couple of years ago, the Preservation Alliance gave Bob our James Biddle Award for Lifetime Achievement in Historic Preservation. Well done, Bob. But of course, he's still doing it, which is pretty amazing. So it is a real honor to be here. I'm echoing in my mind George's words about this being the Quaker equivalent of the great cathedrals of Europe, which I know to some Quaker ears sounds discordant, because I understand that's not what you're going for, but that's what you got. So what I'm going to do tonight, I want to tell you just a tiny bit more about me and a little bit more about the Preservation Alliance, and then talk about why we believe historic buildings are so important to our city, to our region, to our nation, and frankly, the world. So let's see if we can get this to go. All right, well, there's me. Quick bio, George covered some of it. Born and raised in Northeast Philly to a salesman and a church secretary. That picture in the lower right was actually taken outside of this building at the dedication of the Philadelphia Conference marker in, I think it was 2017. It was pre-Sean, I know. Big Phillies fan. I got to throw out the first pitch on Pride Night in 2019. But yes, been dedicated to making my city, our city, a better place for my entire career. The Preservation Alliance, as George mentioned, we're a citywide member-supported historic preservation organization. We date ourselves back to the late 70s, Philadelphia Historic Preservation Corporation. And here's more Bob Yeager trivia. Bob worked for PHPC and got the idea one day, we should start a program to help historic sacred places. And that grew into and spun off from PHPC to become Partners for Sacred Places, and now they're better known than we are. So congratulations to Bob and his team on that. We merged with another organization in '96, and that's why we're called the Preservation Alliance. And these are just a quick summary of what we do. We do advocacy and policy development. In fact, earlier today, we were on a statewide Zoom call with none other than Senator Savall about enhancing the Pennsylvania Historic Tax Credit, which he has agreed to champion on our behalf and on behalf of Preservation Pennsylvania, the statewide historic preservation organization. We hold about 250 preservation easements. If you're familiar with conservation easements of, say, farmland, They are the same thing for historic buildings. For example, the Bellevue, we have an easement on that to make sure it does not get ruined. And they are forever. Easements last forever. Our oldest ones go back to 1979. We do architecture and neighborhood walking tours and other public programming, plus member tours and events. So here we are in this wonderful historic place, and I too want to acknowledge the role that the people who have inhabited this place, who built this place, and who still use this place and call it their spiritual home, have played in fighting for the rights of human beings, for women, civil rights for people of color and African Americans, LGBT rights, people like me, workers' rights, down through the centuries. And it is a remarkable legacy that was, I think, very well covered by that wonderful video we just saw. So thank you for all the work that you've done. Philadelphia, when this building was built in 1804, when it opened, was capital letters, the most important city, really in North America. We were the financial, political, and cultural center of the young nation. We had the largest population of any American city. We were half again as big as New York City, although they were growing faster than us. We also had just lost the federal capital to the swamps of Washington. It's still there, and it's still known as the swamps of Washington. And we had just lost the state capital to Lancaster before it went to Harrisburg. That was in 1799. But I think also interestingly, Pennsylvania was the most diverse state in the Union, which was only 13 states at that point, of course. We were the most cosmopolitan state because we had about evenly divided English, German, and Scots-Irish, with a sizable population of Africans, Afro-Caribbeans, and African Americans. So we were different than just about every other state in the Union. And interestingly, Pennsylvania had many fewer enslaved people than our neighboring states, which was a legacy in large part of Quaker leadership in the cause of abolition. So thank you for that. So now what I want to do is take you through a quick history of some highlights in historic preservation history in the city and the nation. And I'll start with this building just a few blocks away from here. Built between 1732 and 1748. We know about its most famous role in 1776 and its other most famous role in 1787, the Constitution. It was the state capital until 1799 and the national capital until 1800. But then they both moved away, and the city was left with this building. It's actually owned by the state, and without an idea of what to do with it, right? What was it for anymore? It had lost its function, and they proposed selling it off for development, including the square that lies to its south. Can you imagine? We almost lost this building. But there was a historic preservation movement at the time, and the city agreed to buy the building and the square, which was really one of the first important acts for historic preservation in the history of the United States. And then in 1824, the Marquis de Lafayette came over from France for a grand tour of America to celebrate the approaching 50th anniversary of our independence. And he stood at Independence Square and declared that in French, and my French is terrible, but he said in French, it is the Hall of Independence. And because of that moment and what he said is why we now call it Independence Hall. Then moving a few blocks away, anyone recognize that black and white image? That was the slate roof house, built around 1684, so shortly after the city was founded, which was 1682 or 3. It was the home of our founding Quaker, William Penn, for about 2 to 3 years, between 1799 and 1801. It was his second home. But its threatened removal in the mid-19th century prompted one of the first coordinated, widespread efforts to preserve a historic structure in Philadelphia. Now, this building has a fascinating history with a lot of familiar names. It was built, as I said, in 1684 by a guy named Samuel Carpenter. He was one of Philadelphia's largest landowners. Penn and his family lived there, as I said. They rented it for about £80 a year. It was occupied by him, his second wife, Hannah, their daughter, Letitia, and their son, John. It also served as the de facto seat of the provincial government. After the Penns moved out, which is kind of funny to say, right? But they moved out. James Logan, his secretary, lived there until 1704. Then Carpenter sold it at that point to William Trent, if that name sounds familiar. He founded Trenton, the capital of New Jersey. In 1708, Isaac Norris purchased the property, another familiar name if you've heard of Norristown. And he and his family owned it until 1864. By the 1770s, I'm jumping around a little bit, but stick with me, it became a boarding house that was patronized by John Adams and other members of the Continental Congress. But in the 19th century, it kind of went into more pedestrian uses. It was a home of engravers, watchmakers, silversmiths, secondhand clothing dealers, used furniture. It was an oyster saloon. A sign painter had his shop there. But in 1864, the Carpenter, or I guess it was the Norris family, finally decided to sell it to someone who wanted to tear it down. And there was a big outcry, save this house that the Penns lived in. And it got to the point where the Historical Society of Pennsylvania actually offered $30,000 to purchase the house, but then they later withdrew the offer. Now, I'm not clear why. And so the building came down. Despite efforts by private citizens, newspapers, I see Signe Wilkinson is here, were big into it. There was probably one of your predecessors had a cartoon about it. Maybe it was you? Okay, I wasn't going to say that. The city councils even got involved, but it was demolished in August of 1867. Before it came down, it was studied, sketched, and measured. So we have very good plans of it if anyone ever wants to rebuild it. An office building was built to replace it, but it burned down within a year. Another building went up for the Keystone Telephone Company, which was a companion of the Bell system. And that stood until 1976, when it too was vacant and deteriorating. That came down, and then we got Welcome Park with the statue of William Penn by the architecture firm of Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown in 1982, and that's what we still have to this day. Fortunately, we still have Gloria Dei, Old Swedes Church, which is the only building that William Penn is known to have been in that remains standing in the city of Philadelphia. Also a pretty remarkable fact. And thank goodness, thanks in part to partners, they're in pretty good shape and still a going concern. So let's go to the 20th century and the dreaded two-word term of urban renewal. And this marked another evolution in the thinking of what historic preservation is and what it should be and what it could create. So you're all probably familiar with these images. On the left is what it looked like around Independence Hall as late as the 1940s. And then 30 years later, in 1976, the creation of Independence Mall. All of those buildings were demolished. Now, people lament that today, including me, because we think, wow, what a city this could have been. And I guess I need to go forward one. Stuck. There we go. That's what I'm talking about. All those buildings could be full of loft apartments and work from home spaces and cafes and restaurants. But in the 40s, coming out of the war, this was a desolate neighborhood. Not that I was there, but City Hall had moved to Broad and Market at the start of the century, moving the center of business gravity west. The Depression, World War II, and this neighborhood was in pretty bad shape. So you can sort of understand why they did it. And they did it in part because they were afraid that these buildings would catch fire and burn these landmarks of American independence. That's one of the reasons why a lot of these buildings were torn down. It was also this fascination with an urban mall like Washington, D.C., right, the National Mall, to create a similar place to pay tribute to Independence Hall and the role that it played in American independence. And that continued around the rest of the neighborhood. 19th and early 20th century buildings were cleared out. New buildings like the much heralded Society Hill Towers by I.M. Pei. Anybody live there, by the way, in the room? Okay. Still considered a marvel of mid-century American architecture, but at the cost of a lot of historic fabric. On the other hand, it was the largest restoration program in American history because so many federal and colonial era houses were restored. They were sold to families for $1 if they would agree to invest in them and fix them up to National Park Service standards. And at the same time, they brought in nationally known architects to design contemporary buildings that were supposed to be compatible with the historic fabric of the neighborhood. And that gave us Society Hill, which I think is a neighborhood that we're all pretty proud of, right? But it really was a creation of someone's imagination. It's not really a representation of what Philadelphia was like in 1804 when this building was first built. It also meant that we lost such amazing Victorian buildings. Now, the people of the mid-century hated this stuff. It was old, it was run down, it was dirty, it was outmoded. So the famous architect Frank Furness, who's become a cult figure in this century, was reviled. And everything he built in that neighborhood was lost. We call it the Furnace Four, these 4 bank buildings that are all gone. Imagine if they were still here today. Fortunately, we still have the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts, which looks a lot like the Guarantee Trust Building, which stood right next to Carpenter's Hall until about 1960. That lower right image there. So move into the 60s, and what happened in New York? It was the loss of Penn Station. And this was pivotal, not just for New York, but for the nation. There was a concerted effort to save it with marches and editorials and public figures speaking out. That's Philip Johnson, the famous architect, joining a protest to save Penn Station. But the building was demolished in 1962. But that was such an egregious loss and angered so many people across the country that it led to the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966, which literally changed our world, because it created a National Register of Historic Places. It created National Historic Landmarks. Importantly, it created state historic preservation offices in every single state in the Union, and it created the Federal Historic Preservation Tax Credit, which has been such an important incentive for saving historic buildings, including here in Philadelphia. These are some of the great historic buildings that we've been able to save over the past 50 years. Buildings without which Philadelphia would really lose a lot of its identity, right? What if we had lost City Hall? That was actually talked about at one point. What if we had lost the Fairmount Waterworks? I mean, just go down the list. The Victory Building at 10th and Chestnut, which was a boarded-up, graffiti-covered, vacant wreck and almost became a parking lot. Eastern State Penitentiary. My own mother, one time on a tour of that neighborhood, said, they should tear that down. I obviously did not take after her. May she rest in peace. The Litt Brothers Building. The wrecking balls were on the site, literally, before the mayor said stop. And if anyone recognizes in the upper right, anybody know what that graffiti-covered building is? The United States Naval Home was a graffiti-covered vacant eyesore until it became Naval Square. But we've had our losses too, right? Preservation sometimes is more known for what we lost than what we saved. We need better public relations. But we have lost some seriously important structures that have cost the city some of its character, identity, and spirit. And this is just a handful, starting in the lower right, the Boyd Theater, our last Art Deco movie theater. Several buildings on Jewelers Row were taken down about 5 years ago after a spirited fight that made the New York Times. The Naval Hospital in South Philadelphia is now where the Eagles practice facility is, the NovaCare Center. And then, yes, churches, we still lose them. This is St. Laurentius, the landmark Polish Roman Catholic Church in Fishtown was lost just in the past year or two, despite, again, a concerted effort to save it. So why do we preserve? Why is it important that we do this? Why is it important that Art Street Friends Meeting is doing it? The video already gave you the answer, spoiler alert. But let me go through some of the reasons why. And this is a building we're currently active in trying to make sure gets saved. Anyone know what this one is? This is the former Philadelphia College of Pharmacy and Science, graduates of which went on to found some of the most recognizable names in American pharmaceuticals. Burroughs, Sperry, McNeil, Lilly, very important to historic preservation, that's another one. So they built this building in 1927 when they moved from Center City. It was recently sold to St. Joseph's University. St. Joe's, in turn, has decided to sell off the campus. So we stepped in to get this building on the historic register. It's at 43rd and Woodland in southwest Philadelphia, not far from where Bob lives. But why preserve? Why is it so important? Make sure this thing moves. Okay. Well, obviously, economic development is one of those things. Here we have the Divine Lorraine Hotel and the Metropolitan Opera House, both on North Broad Street, both restored and reactivated in the last century. When they were vacant, not only did they do nothing for the economy of the city, they actually dragged it down. They dragged down the psyche of the people. They deterred investors. They undermined civic pride. The restoration of these buildings has brought in new residents, new businesses, such as restaurants, and of course, raise your hand if you've been to the Met for any kind of event since it reopened. If you haven't, please make a point to look at the schedule and go see what they did there. Both of them came very close to being lost. And both of them are, once again, contributing to the economy of our city. Okay, that's good. Equity, another important reason why we preserve. Historic preservation was kind of like a lot of things in our world, right? Was kind of promoted and led by majority white people for a very long time. And there's have been efforts over many years to change that, but they really got a push in 2020 with the murder of George Floyd and the other events that opened our eyes to the ways in which we were not doing what we're doing the right way, the way we were not acknowledging the histories and celebrating the heritage of all peoples, telling all the stories. And so for the past almost half decade now, the historic preservation movement has been really working hard to change that. It's hard, it can be slow, there can be setbacks, but it's so important and we're really trying to remain committed to it. So these are just some examples of things that we're doing to try to balance our track record. One is we're working with Partners for Sacred Places on the Fund for Black Sacred Places, so that sacred places important to African Americans are not lost the way St. Laurentius was. And we just made decisions on the first handful of grants to sacred places around the city, including Mother Bethel is one of them, as is New River, as a matter of fact, that Bob made reference to. The Byberry Township African American Burial Ground, working with Mary Ellen McNish. Where is she? Right there. An astonishing story I could talk for an hour on, and then she could talk for an hour more. But this is something that you can see about a year ago to the day, a cleanup that we all participated in, and we're on the verge of getting the State Department of Community and Natural Resources to absorb it into Benjamin Rush State Park in Northeast Philadelphia to provide for its long-term stewardship and to celebrate the heritage of the African Americans who are interred there, as well as the Quakers who created it. And Byberry Friends Meeting, as you well know, is still alive and well. In fact, that's where I went to my first Friends meeting, not too long ago. The Henry Ossawa Tanner House is a house at 29th and Diamond Street. Henry Tanner was America's most important artist of color. In fact, one of America's most important artists of his generation, who grew up in this house. The house has been vacant and deteriorating for many years. There's a community-led partnership, Black-led partnership to raise money for its restoration. We are serving as their fiscal sponsor and advisor, and they're making tremendous progress, raising hundreds of thousands of dollars to correct the problems of this house and ultimately to reopen it as a celebration of the heritage of Tanner and his family. And finally, the Marian Anderson House and Museum. In the summer of 2020, a pipe burst while they were closed because of COVID. Didn't discover it for 2 days. Did tremendous damage to the house and to the collections. They are on the verge of reopening after much needed repairs. And honestly, they're going to open better than they were. Thank goodness. So there are real success stories to be told there. And there's also been a concerted effort to recognize more Black heritage sites on the Philadelphia Register of Historic Places, which is the city's register of places that matter. And there have been 33 places added to the Historic Register since 2020, including the birthplace of, or the childhood home of Wilt Chamberlain, fraternal organizations, institutions, other prominent people like C. Dolores Tucker, Pearl Bailey, and so on. And that effort continues, not just by the Preservation Alliance, but by other preservation advocates across the city. Very important work. And we've been working since 2020 with the predominantly Latino community of Eastern North Philadelphia on a program of tours to expose folks both within and beyond the neighborhood to the cultural heritage of that part of our city. So the work continues. Affordable housing is another major initiative of preservationists and has been for a long time. It is said that the most affordable house is the one you're already in. And when people lose their homes to deterioration, it can be disastrous. And it happens all too often in this city and others. And at the same time, preservation can be expensive. I've often thought if we could only direct even 10% of the money that's been spent to expand suburban sprawl across cities like Philadelphia and beyond into the restoration and repair of old neighborhoods, what could this city look like? So it's a constant battle. Oh, I should also mention the building on the upper left is a former textile mill in Kensington that just opened. It's at A in Indiana in Kensington. Just reopened as affordable housing using the historic and low-income tax credits, about 166 units. And later this year, we'll be honoring two heroes of people providing affordable housing in our city, Sister Mary Scullion and Joan McConnon, with the Mary Werner Donati Award, given to a civic leader who has made an outstanding contribution to historic preservation, because as Project Home has created over 1,000 residences for people who need them across the city. They've been restoring and repurposing historic buildings across the city. And that will be in September. Preservation also helps with sustainability. The quote on the bottom, the greenest building is the one already built. Every building we're in, including this one, was built out of materials extracted from the earth. All of those materials are finite. So if we preserve and reuse buildings, we're not only saving the materials and the energy that went into creating them and building them, but we're preventing the further expenditure of those materials to build new buildings. Not that new construction doesn't have a place in our world, it certainly does. but we're trying to adjust the balance to something that's more healthy for the long-term survival of the Earth. And it really is that level of existential need that we need to be focused on. Tourism is a companion to economic development. Who doesn't go to another city and seek out the historic landmarks? And people do that here as well. And the words aren't showing up, but this is civic pride. These landmarks and neighborhoods add to pride in our neighborhoods and in our city. So many reasons to restore, to pursue historic preservation. And then for this, and I'm going to close with this, I'm going to paraphrase some of what my friend Tom Mays wrote in this book, which I would highly recommend, Why Old Places Matter. And he named all these dozen reasons, some of which we've already talked about. Old places help us remember. Old places embody our civic, state, and national identity. Old places give us an understanding of our history that nothing else can, not documents, not manuscripts, not books. Historic sacred places are revered here and around the world. Old places help people learn about the world and themselves. Old places connect us with our ancestors. Old places foster community. And old places matter. So as we stand here today, at the beginning of this campaign, I hope we keep those lessons in mind. And now I'll just run through a few exemplary recent projects that we're celebrating this year in Philadelphia for their recent preservation. The Battery up in Fishtown next to Penn Treaty Park, a 1920s electric generating plant that's been repurposed as housing, offices, event space, and more. This former synagogue in North Philadelphia that became a couple of different churches before it finally went vacant is now 22 apartments. Another mill building in Kensington called Paper Factory Lofts has been repurposed as housing. It's so exciting, I think, to see these transformations. The Bach Building, I was speaking with some of you beforehand. This is a 1930s vocational high school that was closed in 2013 and has been, am I out of time? I am, it's past 7:30, but I'm almost done. Who's been to Bach since it reopened? It is full of almost 200 small businesses, maker spaces. There's a person in there who's making hats that Urban Outfitters sells. There's a bakery. There are a couple of restaurants. And there's a wonderful bar and restaurant on the 8th floor with unobstructed views of Center City that you all should visit. In fact, they just opened for their new season this week.
Refugees.
Clinic for Refugees, that's great to know, and an art school, actually, is in there as well.
I can't resist adding to the history. I went to kindergarten, lower, not even kindergarten, nursery school in Bach in 1942.
Wow.
My father was the first African-American high school teacher in Philadelphia, and he was in Bach.
Wow.
Because of that, I got to go to nursery school.
Wonderful story. That's fantastic.
Well, thank you.
And see, the audience always steals the show in the end, right? And this is one of my favorites too, because this is in West Philly, 46th and Market. Real white elephant, hasn't really had a purpose for at least a decade, and in some ways not for 30 years. It was restored with historic tax credits. It now has a unit of Children's Hospital, other healthcare facilities, and a charter school at 46th and Market, really contributing in so many ways to the revival of that part of the city. So yeah, let's close on Arch Street Meeting House. Please support this campaign. I hope tonight you've heard some additional reasons why what Sean and the leadership here is trying to do is truly worthy of your support. Thank you very much.